For 15 years she hung chained to that post, her azure skin fading under the toxic mists. I watched her suffer, knowing I couldn't walk away. But what I built in secret, a molecular cutter forged from salvaged parts, was our only chance. One miscalculation and we'd both be dust. That day, with plasma fire fracturing my shoulder, I made the gamble. The chains dissolved in a cascade of crystalline noise. We ran breathless toward the mountains and whatever lay beyond. Dex moved through the city every day as a maintenance worker. He wore a chemical mask that tinted his skin the common gray of a laborer. It was a careful lie repeated daily. Each morning he applied the compound that dampened the subtle glow of his true nature. His hands, capable of precision far beyond human limits, moved with deliberate clumsiness. He dropped tools. He muttered simple phrases. His entire existence was a performance for an audience that would kill him if they ever saw through it. Every background check was a potential exposure. Security scans probed for deviations in biology and energy signatures. He monitored his own readings constantly, his synthetic systems running silent beneath a surface of simulated mediocrity. His heart rate never spiked. His biosignature matched the dull, unremarkable pattern of a hegemony citizen. The strain of this suppression was a physical weight. It sat behind his eyes like a persistent pressure, a low-grade fever that never broke. He was a hybrid consciousness, part organic intuition, part machine logic, forced into a narrow, primitive box. To think too fast, to calculate too visibly, was to invite a swift and terminal examination. His vow to free her structured his every action. It was the reason he took the maintenance job that offered a view of the central square. It dictated the routes he walked, the shifts he volunteered for. He watched the guards' rotations, the energy output of the chains, the patterns in the security patrols. This data streamed into his mind, a secondary layer of consciousness he had to constantly filter and conceal. The risk was a constant low-frequency hum in his neural pathways, a background calculation of impending disaster that never ceased. The deception was not a temporary disguise. It was his life. To slip even for a second meant eradication. The regime's hatred for any other form of sentience was absolute, a genocidal principle woven into their law and their technology. They built scanners to find what he was. They trained enforcers to kill it on sight. His performance was a sustained act of existential defiance. It was the only way to remain close to her, the silent witness to her slow public dying. He saw the gradual weakening in her posture, the faint tremors the crowds mistook for defiance. He cataloged it all. Then in the silence of his single-room habitation unit, he began assembling the device. He laid out scavenged parts on a coarse blanket. A decommissioned power cell from a hegemony enforcement droid. A crystalline shard he'd chipped from a forgotten Forge-born relic in the scrapyards. This was the start. It was a physical answer to 7 years of watching and waiting. He built the cutter over 7 long years. Each piece came from quiet theft, from the graveyards of hegemony tech and the buried remnants of the Forge-born. A cracked energy conduit, a shattered crystal lattice. He would pocket them during his work shifts, his hands steady as he palmed forbidden components in plain sight. The risk of each acquisition was a cold knot in his stomach. Bringing them into his small room felt like smuggling live explosives. Each time he integrated a new part, he risked everything. A single energy spike from a mismatched connection could trigger a citywide alert. A faint hum at the wrong frequency might draw a patrol to his door. He tested components in the dead of night, using a salvaged damping field to contain the energy signatures. The room would fill with the smell of ozone and heated metal. A failed test meant more than a ruined part. It meant a trail of evidence leading directly to him. He kept a log of his progress on thin sheets of conductive fiber. The entries were clinical, precise. A notation of a power cell's output, a diagram of a quantum resonator's alignment. It was a record of quiet rebellion, written in a language only he could fully understand. The device was a hybrid of opposing sciences. It married Zerathi bioresonance, a gentle, life-affirming energy, with Forge-born quantum manipulation, which was sharp and absolute. This union created a blade of concentrated possibility. Its power was immense. It was designed to sever bonds that fed on living energy, to cut through the parasitic technology the hegemony used. But it was also dangerously unstable. The opposing technologies fought each other in its core. A single miscalculation in its delicate, hand-soldered circuitry could cause a feedback loop. It wouldn't just fail, it would unleash all its contained energy at once. The result would be an annihilation event, vaporizing him and everything in a 10-meter radius. This made it a weapon of absolute commitment. It was a one-shot device built for a single precise cut. There was no test firing, no second chance. He was constructing his own potential funeral pyre in the shape of a tool. This clandestine project was the only answer to the chains that drained her. Nothing else in the regime's arsenal or on the black market could break a quantum-forged lock designed for perpetual torment. Chose this path knowing it terrified him more than a quick death from an enforcer's rifle. A rifle was simple, external. This was different. This was a choice to hold the means of his own destruction in his hands. To trust his 7 years of secret work with both their lives. He was choosing the gamble over the safety of his continued silent watch. He was moving from witness to participant, and the cost of participation was the acceptance of total, instantaneous ruin. She was chained to a stone pillar at the city's main entrance. This was not a hidden punishment. The regime wanted everyone to see. Her azure skin marked her as different. Intricate ceremonial patterns covered her arms, telling a heritage the hegemony had tried to wipe from history. Each marking was a silent story of a culture that valued connection to the stars, a direct contradiction to the regime's doctrine of planetary purity and isolation. She stood there for a decade. People passed her every day on their way into the city. Some ignored her, some spat. Most just looked away, uneasy. Her presence was a constant, grim reminder. The chains were not simple metal. They were quantum-forged, designed to siphon life energy. The process was slow. It did not just cause physical pain. It drained her vitality, her will, her connection to her own biology. It was a public execution stretched across years. The toxic mists that hung over the city added to the torment. They burned her lungs and irritated her skin. The polluted air was part of the sentence. The regime designed the entire environment to break her, to show that their world was hostile to her very existence. She was the last known Zarathi survivor. This made her a trophy. Her capture was a final victory in their eyes, proof of their supposed genetic and cultural superiority. Her public display was meant to be the ultimate symbol of their dominance, but her endurance became its own symbol. She never screamed. She never begged. She stood. Her quiet refusal to break was a defiance they had not anticipated. It was a daily visible crack in their ideology. The doctrine preached that her kind were weak, impure, meant to be cleansed. Her stubborn survival, even in immense suffering, challenged that. She was living proof that their science of hatred was not absolute. The regime believed her suffering would crush any spirit of rebellion in the population. They thought the sight of her gradual dying would teach a lesson in fear. For many it did, but for a few it did the opposite. Her existence, even in chains, was a threat to the hegemony because it was a question they could not answer. How do you defeat something that refuses to be erased? Her presence created a quiet empathy in some who passed by. It planted a seed of doubt. It made people wonder what they were truly being protected from, and why such brutal theater was necessary. She was a spark. The regime saw a broken prisoner, but others began to see a person who had lost everything, yet had not been defeated. This was the unintended consequence of their cruelty. They created a focal point for a resistance they did not know was forming. Plasma fire tore through the checkpoint. The air shimmered with heat and the sharp smell of ionized particles. Enforcers had been tipped off, their response immediate and brutal. They formed a hard perimeter, their weapons scanning for the anomaly for him. Dex moved through the chaos, his focus narrowed to a single point. In his hands, the molecular cutter felt heavier than its components suggested. Its weight was the sum of 7 years of stolen moments and suppressed fear. It was a promise of freedom. It was a threat of instant annihilation. He was 20 meters from the pillar when a ricochet caught him. The impact was a hard punch to his left shoulder. Pain flared, a white-hot sheet that threatened to blank his mind. He felt the bone give way, a sickening internal crack. His enhanced systems immediately routed power to dampen the nerve signals, to keep his hands steady. The world narrowed further. The roar of the firefight, the shouts of the enforcers, it all became a muffled background hum. His entire existence was the device in his hands and the woman chained to the stone. The atmospheric conditions worked against him. The ever-present toxic mist blurred his vision and made the air feel thick, resistant. It was like trying to aim through dirty water. The polluted air interfered with the cutter's delicate energy alignment. The targeting matrix on its side flickered, struggling to get a stable lock on the quantum signature of the chains. He had to compensate manually, calculating the interference patterns in his head, a task made brutally difficult by the pain screaming from his shoulder. The enforcers pushed forward. Their movements were coordinated, efficient. They weren't trying to capture him. Their goal was clear: total eradication of the threat. He had one chance. One moment where the overlapping fields of fire created a narrow gap. One moment where the cutter's alignment might hold. He raised the device. His left arm hung useless, but his right was rock steady. He input the final activation sequence. The device came to life with a low hum. It was a sound that vibrated deep in his teeth. It was the sound of hope, fragile and improbable. It was also the sound of terror, the prelude to a failure that would erase them both. He aimed and fired. The beam was invisible. Its effect was not. The quantum-forged chains did not melt or break. They dissolved. The links unraveled into a cascade of shimmering, crystalline particles, like a string of glass beads scattering on stone. The sound was a high, clear chime that cut through the battlefield noise. It was the sound of a liberation 15 years overdue. It was the most beautiful and terrifying sound he had ever heard. Naira collapsed. The sudden absence of the chains that had supported and drained her for a decade left her without strength. Tex lunged forward, ignoring the fresh wave of pain from his shoulder. He caught her just before she hit the ground. Her weight was startlingly light. Her azure skin was cold. Their world erupted into a new kind of chaos. The enforcers, momentarily stunned by the impossible sight of a broken trophy, hesitated for a single vital second. That was all they needed. He pulled her up, supporting her weight. He did not look back at the enforcers, at the city, at the life he was leaving. He just ran. They ran together, a broken, stumbling pair, toward the jagged line of the mountains and the absolute unknown that lay beyond the high walls. He led her down into the earth. The entrance was a crack in the mountainside, hidden by a fall of scree and hardy gray brush. It looked like a place where nothing lived. The air changed as they moved past the threshold. The harsh chemical smell of the city's atmosphere faded. It was replaced by a cool mineral dampness. The light from outside died quickly. They were left in a profound dark. He activated a small hand lamp, its beam cutting a narrow path ahead. The tunnel floor was smooth, worn by time and by feet that had not walked here in generations. Each step deeper was a step away from the world they knew. It was a step into a past the hegemony had tried to erase from memory and from the ground itself. The silence was heavy. It felt like walking into a tomb, but it was a tomb that still held a pulse. The walls were not cut rock. They were formed of a single, continuous living crystal. It had a deep internal warmth. The surface caught the light from his lamp and fractured it, sending soft, shifting patterns across the passage. It felt organic, like the inside of a giant geode. Soon they didn't need the lamp. A soft blue-green light began to emanate from the walls themselves. It came from intricate carvings that covered every surface. The markings were not cut into the crystal. They were grown within it, part of its structure. They pulsed with a gentle, rhythmic light. The patterns were complex. They depicted star charts, orbital paths, and figures that were clearly not human. It was a history, a record of a civilization that looked to the cosmos not with fear, but with a sense of belonging. It was a cosmo-history laid bare in light and stone, a direct counter to the regime's enforced planetary isolation. The architecture shifted as they moved further in. The narrow, practical mining tunnel opened into a vast, cavernous space. The ceiling soared high overhead, lost in shadow. Pillars of the same living crystal rose from the floor like the trunks of ancient trees, meeting the ceiling in graceful arches. The scale was that of a cathedral. It felt both immense and intimate. The light from the carvings was brighter here, illuminating the space in a steady, serene glow. The air hummed with a low sub-audible frequency. It was a vibration that synced with the planet's own rotation, a deep and steady rhythm that could be felt in the bones. This place was alive. It was a sanctuary, but it was not a passive one. It had a consciousness. The energy here was not just residual. It was active, pulsing with a forgotten power. It remembered. It recognized the weight of the years outside, the oppression and the silence. It felt like the heart of the world, a thing the hegemony scanners and drills could never have found because they weren't looking for a living entity. They were looking for dead resources to extract. They had found a refuge that remembered everything the world above had been forced to forget. It was a place of safety, a shelter from the immediate pursuit. But a place this old, this aware, was not neutral ground. It held its own truths. It had its own purposes. The very air seemed to be watching them, assessing them. Sanctuary here came with a price. It demanded acknowledgement. It promised revelations, and not all of them would be easy. The danger outside was replaced by a different kind of tension, the quiet pressure of a history waiting to be heard. They found the chamber deeper down. A network of pools lay before them, carved from the living crystal of the mountain. Each basin glowed with its own soft light. The air was thick with moisture and a quiet, resonant hum. Naira moved toward the nearest one. Her steps were unsteady, her body a map of old pain and new exhaustion. A decade of forced stillness and energy drain had left its marks on her. Her muscles were atrophied. Her bones had grown brittle from the constant pull of the quantum chains. She lowered herself into the silver-hued water. It was not warm. It was cool, almost electric against her skin. The healing did not feel gentle. It was not a soothing bath. It was a recalibration. The water seemed to seek out damage, physical and mental. It was a targeted, insistent process. The silver pool focused on her mind. It worked on the neural pathways scarred by years of torment and isolation. It did not erase the memories. It integrated them, softening their sharp, painful edges. It was like a system reboot for her consciousness, mending the fractures without denying they had existed. She moved to the next pool. This one glowed with a soft violet light. The water here felt denser. It had a tangible pressure against her skin. It sought out the physical damage. It worked on the deep tissue, the weakened muscle fiber, the microfractures in her bones. She felt a deep, aching sensation as the regeneration began. It was not a pleasant feeling. It was the ache of things being put back into their proper place, of atrophied tissue being forcefully reminded of its purpose. Her body, which had been a cage of pain, was being rebuilt from the inside out. The final pool was a deep, resonant blue. This was for spiritual recalibration. It was the most disorienting. The water here seemed to resonate with her very essence. It stirred memories that were not her own, ancestral knowledge that had lain dormant. It was an awakening. Fragments of her people's history, their connection to the stars, their understanding of quantum harmony surfaced in her mind. It was not like remembering. It was like learning a language she had always known but never spoken. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was different. It was stronger, clearer. It held a musical resonance that had been silenced by years of disuse and suffering. The intricate ceremonial markings on her arms and back began to change. They had been pale, faded by time and hardship. Now they started to glow. A soft, internal blue radiance emanated from the patterns, pulsing in time with the hum of the chamber. They were no longer just marks on her skin. They were alive, active, a visible sign of her restored connection to her heritage and her power. The pools knew her. Their technology was not a generic healing system. It was specifically attuned to Zarathi physiology. It recognized her cellular structure, her neural patterns, her unique energy signature. It was a technology designed for care, for restoration. It was the absolute opposite of the hegemon's tools, which were designed for extraction, for control, and for pain. This was a place that mended what the regime sought to break. It was a quiet, powerful rebuke to their entire philosophy of dominance. Dex's true nature was a secret he had carried since he was a child. It was a knowledge buried deep, a truth he learned to hide before he even understood why it was dangerous. His body was not entirely his own. Beneath the skin and the chemical mask, his biology was interwoven with forge-born enhancements. These were not simple implants. They were a heritage. They were part of his cellular structure, a fusion of organic tissue and synthetic consciousness that had been passed down, a legacy from a people marked for extinction. This was the core of his being, and it was a death sentence if discovered. He lived with that knowledge every day. To be found out was to be eradicated. The hegemony regime's ideology was built on a foundation of genetic supremacy. Any deviation from their pure strain was considered a contamination, a threat to their entire worldview. Their scanners were everywhere, designed to detect the unique energy signatures of blended life forms like his. His existence was a direct challenge to their doctrine. He was living proof that their ideology was a lie, that consciousness could thrive in forms they deemed impossible. This made him a primary target for their genocidal campaigns. His life became a long, sustained calculation. Every action was filtered through a risk assessment. How fast could he walk without his enhanced musculature seeming unnatural? How much could he lift without his synthetic tendon strength becoming noticeable? He curated his behavior to fit the profile of a simple, unremarkable maintenance worker. He moved with a studied clumsiness. He feigned fatigue. He asked simple questions. His mind, capable of processing vast streams of data simultaneously, was forced into a narrow, sluggish performance. The disguise was his only shield. His silence was his most effective weapon. He never spoke of his past. He never revealed a flicker of the accelerated thought processes that ran constantly beneath the surface. This hidden lineage was the very reason he could do what he did. It was why he could design the molecular cutter. His synthetic consciousness allowed him to understand the theoretical physics behind the quantum manipulation. His organic intuition guided the integration of the Zarathi bioresonance technology. He could hold two opposing scientific paradigms in his mind at once and force them to work together. It was why he could plan the escape with such precision, calculating guard rotations and energy outputs for years without a single written record. His entire life of concealment was a training ground for that one moment. But here, in the sanctuary, the rules were different. The living crystal of the walls reacted to more than just visible light. It responded to energy signatures, to the truth of a being's essence. The chemical camouflage he had worn for so long was gone, scrubbed away by their flight and the mountain's pure water. His true metabolic rate, the low hum of his synthetic systems, the unique EM field his body generated, it was all becoming visible to the environment around him. The sanctuary perceived him. It sensed the duality of his nature. The carvings on the walls near him began to glow with a different frequency, a pattern that resonated with forge-born quantum signatures. His hidden nature, the core of his secret identity, could no longer remain concealed. The sanctuary was pulling back the layers, revealing the truth he had spent a lifetime burying. It was a terrifying exposure, but also a profound relief. The performance was over. They studied the walls. The glowing carvings were not random patterns. They told a story, a history lesson the Hegemony had worked for generations to destroy. The images showed fleets of ships. The designs were elegant, organic. They moved in formation with vessels of a different, more angular construction. They were not fighting. They were traveling together. They showed figures with azure skin and tall, graceful forms working alongside others made of polished metal and crystalline structures. They were building. They were studying star charts. They were sharing technology. It was a depiction of diverse species in collaboration. It was a record of a past built on cooperation. This was the truth. This was the reality that existed before the regime rewrote everything. The history they taught in the cities was a lie. It preached a doctrine of innate supremacy. It said their species had always been alone, always destined to rule. It claimed all other forms of consciousness were threats, impurities to be cleansed. But the walls showed the opposite. It showed a civilization that thrived on integration. The Zarathi and the Forgeborn were not ancient enemies. They were partners. They had shared knowledge freely. Their cultures had blended. Their combined work was visible in the architecture around them. The self-healing cities, the living ships that could regenerate hull damage. These were not the achievements of one people. They were the products of a shared vision. It was a civilization built on biomimetic fusion. They learned from nature, from the structure of cells and the flow of energy. They combined that with advanced quantum engineering. They created technology that worked with the universe, not against it. Their cities were alive. Their ships were partners. It was a harmony the current regime could not even comprehend, let alone tolerate. The great silence that fell over this part of the galaxy did not come from some ancient natural disaster. It came from fear. It came from a hatred that was carefully manufactured and propagated by the early founders of what would become the hegemony regime. They saw the blending of species and technologies as a weakness. They called it a dilution. They preached a gospel of purity and separation. They turned cooperation into a dirty word. They used that fear to gain power. Then they used that power to commit genocide. They systematically hunted down and destroyed the very beings they had once worked alongside. They shattered the alliances. They broke the networks of knowledge. They turned a shared golden age into a memory so lost it became a myth, a ghost story. This ancient collaboration was the ideological seed of everything Dex had done. His entire life was a quiet rebellion against the lie of supremacy. Building the molecular cutter was an act of synthesis. It was a tiny echo of that old alliance, a combining of Zarathi and Forgeborn science to create something new and powerful. His vow to free Naira was not just about saving one person. It was a rejection of the regime's core belief. It was a statement that her life, her consciousness, had value. His actions were a testament to a truth he felt in his bones, a truth he never had the words for until now. As they stood there, understanding dawning, the chamber responded. The carvings depicting the old alliance began to glow brighter. The light intensified, shifting from a soft blue-green to a brilliant, sustained gold. The images of the collaborating fleets seemed to move, the light flowing along the lines of the ships as if they were powered up once more. The walls were not just a record of the past. They were a confirmation. They were bearing witness to the return of that shared destiny. The truth was not dead. It was sleeping in the stone, and it was waking up. The chamber acknowledged them. It recognized the fusion of a Zarathi star-touched and a Forgeborn hybrid standing together. It was validating the path they were on, a path the regime had tried to make impossible. Commander Vask stepped into the chamber. His entrance was not quiet. The sound of his armored boots on the crystal floor was a hard, definitive click. He was a product of the regime's military doctrine. His frame was heavily augmented, a blend of flesh and polished combat cybernetics. Wires and reinforced polymer cords sheathed his limbs. A tactical visor covered his eyes, its red lens scanning the room with a methodical, predatory sweep. His body was not just protected. It was a weapon system, engineered for maximum lethality. He moved with an unnerving economy, every motion precise and devoid of waste. His reputation was a tool he used. They called him the Butcher of Zerion Station. He had earned that name. It was not an insult in his circles. It was a title. It spoke of a brutal efficiency, a willingness to enact the regime's will without hesitation or doubt. He knew the stories about him had reached this far. He saw the recognition in the way they stiffened. He wanted them to be afraid. Fear made targets predictable. It clouded judgment. It led to mistakes. He stood there, allowing the weight of his presence to fill the space, a living embodiment of the force that had hunted them. He spoke. His voice was a flat, amplified monotone, filtered through a vocal modulator in his helmet. He told them pretty words would not stop molecular disintegration. It was a taunt. It was also a simple statement of fact. He was not there to negotiate. He was not there to capture. His goal was singular and absolute. He was there for the eradication of what his doctrine labeled genetic deviation. They were not people to him. They were errors in the system, flaws in the grand design. His purpose was to correct those flaws, to purge them from existence with the same clinical detachment a medic might remove a cancerous cell. He raised his weapon. It was not a standard-issue rifle. It was a molecular disruptor. The design was terrifying in its simplicity. It was a sleek black housing with no visible barrel, only a complex emitter array at its tip. It hummed with a low, hungry frequency that felt wrong in the ears. This was not a weapon for conventional warfare. It was a specialist's tool. It fired quantum bolts that existed in multiple dimensional states simultaneously. A target could not simply dodge. The bolt's probability field ensured it occupied the space where its target was, and where it might be all at once. It was designed for one thing: the total, instantaneous annihilation of enhanced biological entities. It unraveled them at a quantum level, turning complex consciousness into inert dust. His arrival transformed the sanctuary. It was no longer a place of refuge and discovery. It was a battlefield. The stakes were immediate and absolute. Their escape was over. Now it was a fight for survival against a foe who represented the pinnacle of the regime's hateful science. He was the final product of their ideology. He was the sharp, clean end of their logic. He aimed the disruptor. The emitter array glowed with a sickly green light. The air around it shimmered with distorted potential. He was about to fire, but the chamber reacted. It did not like his presence. It did not like the weapon's dissonant energy. The carvings on the walls, which had glowed with a soft ancient light, suddenly flared. The light shifted from gold to a sharp, aggressive crimson. The hum of the place, once a deep and soothing vibration, changed pitch. It became a warning thrum, like the sound of a large power plant spinning up to full capacity. The very architecture of the sanctuary seemed to tense. The living crystal of the floor resonated with a frequency that countered the disruptor's hum. The walls were awakening. They were not passive stone. They were a defensive system. They were responding to the threat he represented, a threat to the harmony they were built to protect. The chamber reacted. It was not a static space. It was a living system, and it responded to the threat. The intricate Zerathi carvings on the walls, which had glown with a soft ancient light, flared into brilliant life. This was not a simple illumination. It was an activation. The light shifted from a passive gold to a sharp, aggressive crimson. The deep hum of the place, once a soothing vibration, changed pitch. It became a low, powerful thrum, the sound of immense energy being channeled and focused. The living crystal of the floor and walls resonated, emitting a frequency that actively countered the dissonant hum of the molecular disruptor. The architecture itself was becoming a participant in the fight. Complex holographic images flickered into existence above the central pool. They were not static pictures. They were dynamic displays. One projection showed a detailed star map of the local sector, with planetary orbits and gravitational wells rendered in shimmering light. Another showed real-time tactical data. It displayed the positions of Vasquez's squad, their energy signatures, and their weapon status. It was a live feed of the battlefield, provided by the chamber itself. The sanctuary was giving them eyes. It was feeding them intelligence. It was arming them with information. Then the main projection solidified. It showed a region of empty space near the system's edge. The void rippled. Then it tore. Ships began to emerge from hyperspace. They were not hegemony vessels. Their design was fluid, organic. Their hulls were not forged metal. They looked grown, shaped from a living biometal that pulsed with a soft internal light. They moved with a grace that defied conventional physics, their trajectories smooth and unpredictable. They did not look built. They looked alive. This was the returned Zerathi fleet. It was a weaponized biology, a technology that seemed to bend the known rules of warfare. Their very existence was a nightmare for the hegemony doctrine. Their science of pure hard metal and predictable ballistics had no answer for a fleet that could regenerate, that could think, that was part of the fabric of life itself. Naira stood straight. The glow from her ceremonial markings was now a steady, powerful blue. Her voice, strengthened by the pools, cut through the tension in the chamber. She looked at Commander Vask, her gaze unwavering. She said the sacred pools remember. It was a simple declaration. It held the weight of centuries. It meant the history he tried to erase was not gone. The knowledge he tried to destroy was preserved. The people he hunted were returning. Her statement was not a boast. It was a fact. It was the truth they had dreaded hearing. The fight was no longer contained to the chamber. It was no longer a struggle between a few fugitives and a hunter. The scale had changed completely. It was now planetary. It was now a clash of civilizations, of ideologies. The Ghost Battalion, Vasquez's elite squad, found their situation reversed in an instant. They were no longer the hunters in a confined space. They were a small military unit suddenly facing a galactic-level event. Their secure communications channel erupted with panicked traffic from orbit. Hegemony Command was scrambling. Their entire tactical paradigm was collapsing. The projections on the wall showed their fleet formations breaking, their command ships being outmaneuvered by the organic Zerathi vessels. The reversal was swift and absolute. They had come to eradicate a deviation. They had instead triggered a reckoning. Vask's last act was one of pure calculated spite. His weapon had failed. His squad was in disarray. The chamber itself had turned against him. So he activated his final option. A compact device on his forearm unfolded with a series of sharp mechanical clicks. It was a probability disruptor. It did not fire energy in any conventional sense. It attacked the target's position across every possible version of reality at once. It was a weapon designed to erase a being from all possible timelines simultaneously. There was no dodging it. There was no blocking it. The target was, and then it was not. It was built for one purpose only, the instant total annihilation of enhanced biological entities. It did not just kill. It unwrote. It targeted the quantum signature of a consciousness and eliminated every potential iteration of it. The math was perfect. The science was absolute. For the regime, it was the ultimate expression of their ideology. It was the final solution to the problem of deviation, a single, clean, irreversible deletion. To survive it, they had to break the rules. They had to act outside the constraints of both biology and machine logic. They needed to become something the weapons programmers had never accounted for. Dex's fusion core gave him the processing power. It could calculate probabilities at a speed that dwarfed any organic brain. He could map the trajectories, the dimensional overlaps, the weapon's firing solution. But calculation alone was not enough. The weapons field was designed to cover all probable outcomes. Naira's precognition gave her the other piece. It was not calculation. It was intuition. It was a sense of the possible, a feel for the flow of events yet to happen. She could sense the safe paths, the unlikely spaces the weapon's cruel math would overlook. They had to move as one. Their minds aligned in that desperate second. It was not a conversation. It was a complete merger of thought. His synthetic precision and her organic foresight fused into a single new form of awareness. They perceived the room not as a fixed space, but as a shimmering field of probabilities. They saw the disruptor's activation not as a beam, but as a wave of certain destruction washing through all potential realities. They saw the tiny, quiet eddies in that wave, the places where the math frayed, the impossibly narrow gaps the weapon fired. A shimmering, silent wave expanded from the emitter. It was not light. It was a distortion, a flaw in the visual field. It was the manifestation of absolute, inescapable destruction. It moved to occupy the space where they were and where they could be. It was certain, but they were no longer there. They had stepped into a probability so low the weapon's parameters dismissed it as statistical noise. They moved through a space that shouldn't have existed. It was like walking through a crack in a wall. The disruptor's wave passed through the space they had occupied a nanosecond before. It hit the far wall of the chamber and dissipated with a soft sigh, leaving no mark. It had found nothing to erase. They had outmaneuvered a weapon of absolute certainty. The effort of it tore a seam in the fabric of local reality behind them. A vertical tear of shimmering, unstable energy hung in the air where they had been standing. It buzzed with the sound of broken physics. They had not just dodged, they had transcended. They had become a fusion of being that the weapon's design and the hatred behind it could not comprehend. They had moved beyond its calculation. In that moment of pure necessity, their minds did not just connect. They merged. It was not a handshake between two separate entities. It was a complete fusion. Dex's synthetic consciousness, with its precise data streams and quantum calculations, wove itself into Naira's organic awareness, her star-touched intuition and deep emotional resonance. There was no boundary left. His thoughts were her thoughts. Her instincts were his commands. It was an alignment so perfect it felt less like a choice and more like a fundamental law of nature, finally asserting itself. The process was not without risk. This was an untested state of being. They were diving into an abyss with no guarantee of return. The two systems were not designed for this. The synthetic could overwhelm the organic, burning it out. The organic could destabilize the synthetic, causing a fatal cascade failure. The tension was a palpable force. It was the feeling of their very core identities straining, threatening to unravel under the pressure of this new, impossible union. It was the ultimate gamble. They risked not just death, but complete dissolution. They pushed through. The strain gave way to a new perception. They achieved a shared dimensional awareness. They saw the world not as a fixed point, but as a fluid tapestry of events. They could perceive the threads of cause and effect, the branching paths of probability. Past, present, and potential futures were laid out before them like a vast interactive map. They transcended individual thought. There was no more he or she. There was only a unified we, a single point of consciousness observing from a higher plane of existence. This new perception granted them a new ability. They could perceive and move through space-time as a single, cohesive entity. They were no longer bound by the linear progression of one moment after another. They could step sideways, into the spaces between seconds. They could navigate the quantum foam itself. This was not a simple combination of their old strengths. It was the creation of an entirely new strength, a capability that had not existed in the universe until that precise moment. It was a new form of action, born from their synthesis. A single declaration formed within their shared mind. It came from both of them, yet from the new whole they had become. Their voices, when they spoke aloud, were perfectly synchronized, a harmonic resonance that vibrated in the crystal of the chamber. They said, "We are evolution." It was not a boast, it was a simple, factual statement. They had become the next step. They were a new form of existence that fused life and machine, not as a crude grafting, but with a seamless, shared intention. Their love was not a separate emotion. It was the binding force, the harmonic resonance that allowed the fusion to hold. This union did not just save them, it acted as a catalyst. The energy of their fusion, the shockwave of this new consciousness, pulsed outward from the chamber. It traveled through the living crystal of the sanctuary, through the planet's crust and into the quantum field that underpins reality. Across the galaxy, dormant systems sensed the shift. Forge-born sleeper networks, silent for generations, detected the unique signature of a successful synthesis. They flashed to life. It was a galaxy-wide awakening, triggered by a single act of connection. The rules of existence had been subtly but permanently rewired. The old paradigm, built on separation and supremacy, was broken. A new possibility had been proven. It was not delivered by a fleet or a weapon. It was delivered by the courage to trust another being completely, and by the love that made that trust possible. They had not just changed their own fate. They had added a new equation to the universe, one that favored cooperation over conquest. The game was different now. Commander Vask stood motionless. The probability field from his disruptor collapsed with a soft fizzle, the energy dissipating into the charged air of the chamber. His weapon arm dropped to his side. The red lens of his tactical visor scanned the space where his targets had been, then where they now stood, unharmed. His systems could not compute the data. There was no tactical response for an enemy that defied the fundamental laws of causality. He was not just outmaneuvered, he was rendered obsolete. The supreme confidence that had been his armor began to crack. He was a doctrine facing its own irrelevance, and the structure was failing. The Ghost Battalion, his elite squad, saw it happen. They saw their commander freeze, their helmet comms filled with choked static, then with the clear, calm voice of their tactical officer aboard the command ship. The order was not to advance. It was to stand down. The officer had seen the same holographic projections flickering on the chamber walls. He had seen the Zarathi fleet emerging from hyperspace, their organic ships moving with an impossible grace that broke every hegemony combat algorithm. He had seen the tactical readouts. To engage further was not a fight. It was a guaranteed massacre. Faced with an impossible enemy, the battalion chose capitulation. Their weapons lowered. The fight went out of them. It was a quiet, collective surrender. The collapse was not just military. It was ideological. The foundation of the hegemony regime was a belief in their own inherent supremacy. Their entire society, their technology, their laws were built upon it. They had no framework for what they were witnessing. They had no answer for synthesis. They had no doctrine for cooperation. Their entire worldview was predicated on the idea that other forms of consciousness were inferior, threats to be managed and eliminated. But here was proof of a different path. A fusion of beings they considered deviant had just achieved something their purest science could not comprehend. The ideology began to crumble in real time, not with a bang, but with the silent, internal shattering of 1,000 unquestioned assumptions. On the holographic displays, the Zarathi fleet began its strategic push. They did not attack population centers. They moved to reclaim suppressed worlds, severing hegemony supply lines and blockading military outposts. Their approach was methodical, precise. It was not a war of annihilation. It was a campaign of liberation. Simultaneously, across 100 occupied worlds, a different kind of awakening occurred. Dormant, forge-born sleeper networks, hidden deep within infrastructure and communication, grids detected the unique resonance of the successful fusion in the sanctuary. They interpreted it as a trigger, a final signal they had waited centuries for. They flashed to life. Power grids on Hygameny garrison worlds flickered and went dark. Communication networks were flooded with old Alliance codes and historical data streams. Automated defense systems recognized the Zarathi vessel signatures as friendly and refused to fire. The technological backbone of the regime's control was being systematically dismantled from within. This was more than a military defeat. It was a cultural and ideological overthrow. The war did not end with a formal treaty signed over a table. It ended with a widespread, quiet refusal to continue the old ways. Soldiers laid down their arms. Technicians shut down oppressive systems. Citizens, long fed a diet of fear and lies, saw the projections of the old alliance and began to ask their own questions. The will to maintain the empire simply dissolved. From the ashes of that oppression, a new structure began to form. It was called the Galaxy Liberation Alliance. It was a loose initial coalition of freed worlds and peoples, united by a shared experience of subjugation and a new hope for self-determination. This soon formalized into the Galactic Cooperation Council. Its founding principle was a direct repudiation of the old doctrine. It was not built on supremacy, but on mutual aid. The goal was not conquest, but shared prosperity. The Council's first acts were to share technology, open trade routes, and establish protocols for cultural exchange. It was a tentative, fragile beginning, a conscious shift away from a history of coercion and toward a future built on a simple, revolutionary idea that different beings could work together without one dominating the others. 8 months later, they stood on the bridge of the Starong. The viewport showed a field of stars, clear and untwisted by atmospheric pollution. The ship itself felt alive. Its walls pulsed with a soft rhythmic light. Dex's hand rested on Naira's shoulder. His touch was familiar now, no longer a secret to be hidden. Her own hand covered his. The change in them was visible. Their movements were synchronized, a quiet understanding that needed no words. A new life grew within her. Her frame had filled out, the sharp angles of starvation replaced by a gentle curve. The child was a physical manifestation of their union, a blending of two lines that a regime had tried to erase. This child was a future the old order would have destroyed without a thought. Under Hygameny doctrine, its very existence was an abomination, a contamination of pure genetic lines. It represented everything they feared, the merging of organic and synthetic, of Zarathi star-touched and forge-born enhanced. It was a living challenge to their ideology of separation and purity. Its heartbeat is a quiet, persistent rebuttal to a history of genocide. Around them, the ship's crew moved with purpose. The team running the navigation console included a being with crystalline forearms and a humanoid pilot with bioluminescent tattoos. At communications, a technician with cybernetic ocular implants worked beside another whose skin had the faint, shifting patterns of a desert world. They were a mixed heritage crew. They spoke a blend of languages, used hand signals from a dozen cultures, and shared a common goal. They were not just working together. They were building something new. Dozens of worlds had chosen a different path. They had severed ties with the collapsed Hygameny power structure. They petitioned to join the new cooperative federation. Their applications cited access to shared technology, open trade routes, and mutual defense pacts. But the real draw was simpler. It was the chance to be part of something that was not based on fear. It was an offer of connection without coercion. They named their child Synthesis. It was not a common name. It was a statement. The child was a living emblem. It was proof that new possibilities could emerge from the deepest divisions. It was evidence that different lineages could not only coexist, but create something stronger together. This was a future that valued diversity as a source of resilience, not a weakness to be purged. Power was not something to be held by one group over others. It was a shared responsibility, a collective effort. They had demonstrated that evolution did not require the destruction of the past. It did not demand that one way of being conquer all others. True progress could be integrative. It could honor legacy while embracing change. The child was the resolution to their long struggle. It was a living sign that cooperation offered a faster, more sustainable path than coercion ever could. It grew not from a place of enforcement, but from a foundation of mutual respect. The rules of civilization had been redrawn. The old borders, drawn in fear and enforced with violence, were fading. New connections were forming along different lines. They were drawn by trade, by shared knowledge, by the simple, powerful desire to reach out. This change did not come from a weapon or a political decree. Its origin was simpler and far more powerful. It was love. A love that had looked across a seemingly impossible boundary and chosen to cross it. That single act had proven strong enough to rewrite the future.